There have been a lot of recent updates in the war in Ukraine and the Donbass. So this video will discuss what really happened in Bucha, the recent missile attack on the Kramatorsk railway station, withdrawal of Russian forces from Kiev, and the advancing situation of the Russian military operation in Ukraine, as well as the situation of American biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine. Now, as far as the pullback of Russian forces from Kiev, there has been a lot of propaganda claiming that this is supposed proof that Russia is somehow losing the war, which is ridiculous. If you actually look at the facts, the Russian forces had 20,000 troops assembled outside of Kiev. Kiev is a city of about 3 million people. Now, if you just look at the numbers there, Russia never had forces sufficient to capture Kiev. So the question is, what was the purpose for these Russian troops to be outside of Kiev? Well, the purpose of these Russian troops was, again, not to capture Kiev, but in fact it was a very intelligent military move on the part of the Russian military to distract the Ukrainian government and distract the Ukrainian military from what was going on in the south of the country, where Russia has, at this point, liberated all of the territory along the coast from Crimea to the Donbass, which is extremely strategic for resupply and movement of forces for their operations. So what they did was they sent these troops outside of Kiev to basically threaten the capital, threaten the Kiev regime, and force them to keep troops there, to tie down Ukrainian forces in Kiev and force them to have some very formidable forces there that otherwise would be able to fight against the Russian forces and the Donbass forces elsewhere. So it was a very strategic move on the part of the Russians, and that was the purpose of it. And they've pulled back, so it's not evidence at all of Russia losing or anything like that. It's complete nonsense. So what we're entering now, this is sort of a sign of the changing situation, that we're going into the second phase of the conflict, where the Russian military and the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic are working to fully liberate the Donbass as well as the eastern part of Ukraine from the Ukrainian Nazi organizations, the Azov Battalion, as well as the Ukrainian military, which is itself very much infiltrated by these neo-Nazi organizations. Besides the Azov Battalion, Right Sector and other Ukrainian ultranationalist Banderite neo-Nazi organizations. So this phase two is moving very effectively. Currently, there is the Battle of Mariupol taking place, and Mariupol is sort of the last holdout, a major holdout in this region of territory controlled by Russia and the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic forces. And in Mariupol, you have the Azov Battalion Nazi military organization, where they're basically encircled at this point, and they're broken into very small pockets inside the city of Mariupol. They were held up in the Ilyich steelworks plant, as well as the Azovstal plant. And as of April 15th, the Ukrainian forces have been broken in the Ilyich steelworks plant, and it has been taken by Russian forces. Now again, the Ukrainian forces still have some forces in the Azovstal plant, where they're held up there at this point, but they're completely cut off, and they are running out of supplies and ammunition. And this situation in the city of Mariupol is very interesting, because there is a lot of discussion as to foreign military in Mariupol, including possibility of foreign generals and officers being trapped there. This is speculation at this point. There isn't any confirmation on this, but the Russian military has stated that they have picked up on a lot of foreign language communications in Mariupol, including Americans, British, other Europeans speaking in their languages in Mariupol, which would indicate that there are these NATO officers or generals or military personnel in Mariupol. Again, this is not confirmed, but there's speculation as to this. And further fueling the speculation, the Ukrainians have been sending in helicopters on almost suicidal missions, desperate to get into Mariupol to evacuate some people from there, which would further indicate that there is possibly some NATO officials or military there. Again, we don't know for certain. This is speculation at this point. But as time passes, this will become more clear whether they're there or not. There is also a possibility that they may have gotten some of them out. The Russians were able to shoot down most of the helicopters, but it's possible that some may have gotten in and possibly escaped. But again, this is not clear at this point, and this will become more clear as time progresses. Now, once the city of Mariupol is liberated, the Russian forces and the forces of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic will be able to operate much more freely and move forward on the offensive against Ukrainian forces in the eastern part of the country. And what has been going on along the borders of Donbass and in Donbass has been the forces of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics have been doing what's called the fixing operations, where they engage with the Ukrainian military and fix them in place so that they're forced to engage them. And that way they're not able to move away and move to another location. The reason for that is so that they could be held there while the Russian military maneuvers and attacks other forces around there, clears as much territory as possible, and traps the Ukrainians in position while the Russian military moves around to strategic points to eventually hit them. And so these Ukrainian forces have been fixed in that position, hammered very heavily. Their communications and such have been cut, and their chain of command has been very much weakened. And so at this point, what many military analysts are suggesting is that what Russia is preparing to do, again, with the clearing of the coast, the southern coast of Ukraine, and moving up along the Donbass and around the north, is basically making an encirclement of the Ukrainian forces, huge numbers of Ukrainian forces. That way, not exactly encirclement, but preparing for an encirclement. That way you have from the south and from the north, and obviously in the east is where the Donbass forces are. And so the north and the south forces can link up behind Ukrainian forces' lines, and then have them encircled and entrapped there, massive numbers. And so that seems to be what the strategy will be going forward. And once that happens, the massive numbers of Ukrainian forces in the eastern part of the country along the Donbass will be caught between a hammer and an anvil. Already, we've seen massive numbers of Ukrainian soldiers surrendering. Just recently, we saw the surrender of 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers en masse surrendered to the Russian military. And as the Russian military operation progresses in Ukraine, you can expect to see many more cases of this, massive numbers of Ukrainian soldiers surrendering. Now, there have also been attacks by the Ukrainian government against Russian territory in some small cases. These are obviously acts of desperation on the part of the Kiev regime. They're not able to do anything to change the situation on the ground. So it's basically, if they, target of opportunity, if they can get away with attacking territory in Russia, that won't really affect the battle inside of Ukraine. They've been trying to do some of these attacks here or there. And Russia has stated that if the Kiev regime continues to do attacks on Russian territory, the Russian military will do what they've actually been holding back on doing, which is to do strikes on Kiev to take out Ukrainian military leadership, which, again, Russia has the full capability to do so. They have extremely sophisticated missiles that NATO even is not even capable of stopping. So they can certainly hit Kiev and take out any target that they wish, but they've been holding back in doing so up until this point. And they are saying to the Ukrainian government that if you continue your attacks, these acts of escalation on the part of the Ukrainian regime, attacks against Russian territory that, again, will make no difference to the actual fight in Ukraine. These are just desperate attacks to try and destabilize Russia, or try and kill Russian civilians, and so on. These attacks, if the Ukrainian government continues, there will be severe consequences to this, including the taking out of their military leadership. Now, another situation of the progressing military situation is the situation with the Russian ship, the Moskva, which sunk. Now, this is a big topic of propaganda in the Western press and by the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government claims that they took it out, they sunk it, and the Western press is echoing that. Although, interestingly, the Pentagon says that they cannot confirm the claims that the Ukrainians sunk it. Now, what the Russian government is stating is that this ship actually sunk due to a fire on the ship, which led to explosions of ammunition, and it was being towed by another ship, and the bad weather conditions ended up sinking it after all this damage. But the crew was not on board when it was sunk. And again, even the Pentagon is stating that they cannot confirm these claims by the Ukrainian government. It's worth mentioning, in the previous video, I spoke about the Vasily Bykov ship, which was claimed to have been sunk. And then it turned out that it wasn't sunk at all. And in fact, it returned to its naval base. And this seems to be a repetition of the Ukrainian propaganda, Western media, NATO propaganda, to play up the supposed effectiveness of the Ukrainian forces and the supposed ineffectiveness of the Russian forces. It seems to be complete nonsense, and it seems the story that the Russian government tells seems to be much more realistic. I mean, the fact that the crew wasn't on board when it sunk would indicate that this was not a missile attack, that this was something that they knew was going on, and that they had took this precaution due to this accident that took place on this ship. Now, the funny thing is, even if the Ukrainian government's claims about supposedly sinking this ship were true, it's just one ship. And even if it were true that the Ukrainians sunk this ship, it would never bring back the Ukrainian Navy. But it's most likely that they didn't. They're just trying to take credit for its sinking, when it seems much more likely that, there was this fire that took place, which caused ammunition to explode, and then the crew was evacuated. And obviously, otherwise, if it was sunk by the Ukrainians, why would the crew not be on board when it was hit? Why would the crew have been evacuated if there wasn't indeed this issue that happened prior? Now, going back to the pullback of the Russian forces from around Kiev, some may ask, even if the goal wasn't to take Kiev, why pull back? Why give any territory to the Ukrainian government? Well, the mission was accomplished of tying down the Ukrainian forces there. And while Russia liberated the southern coast and linked up the Crimea to the Donbass, which is of extreme strategic importance. Now, the reason why they didn't stay there is because staying there indefinitely would make them a target for Ukrainian forces. So their mission was accomplished. There was no longer need for them to be there. And for them to just sit there leaves them as a sitting duck. So they didn't need to be there. But this did lead to an issue, which was the issue of Bucha. Now, the Western press, the Ukrainian government, Joe Biden, the NATO, they're all using this as propaganda to claim that Russia carried out a massacre of Ukrainian civilians. Now, if we look at the facts of what actually happened in Bucha, This is extremely suspicious, and the facts do not add up to what the West is claiming. Now, we have a long history of NATO, the United States, making claims of atrocities by governments that the United States doesn't like. You could think to Iraq during the Gulf War, where the United States claimed that the Iraqi army was taking babies out of incubators. Of course, this came out to be a complete lie, acknowledged by everyone that this was not true afterwards. Then there was all the stuff in Syria, all these claims against the Syrian government that came out to be not true, and even people from the UN and stuff confirming that these were actually not accurate claims against the Syrian government, and Libya and Yugoslavia, and countless examples. The list is way too long to count all the times the United States government and NATO has claimed that someone else committed an atrocity to justify NATO and US aggression. So looking at the specifics of Bucha, immediately after the claims were made of a massacre there, Russia called for an emergency United Nations Security Council meeting, but the United Kingdom and the United States blocked that. Now, if they're claiming that Russia carried out this massacre, isn't it a little bit strange that Russia is the one calling for an immediate emergency UN investigation and meeting an investigation into what happened, and that the United Kingdom and the United States were the ones who tried to stop this from taking place? Now, what has been shown in this incident in Bucha is that there have been civilians massacred, and what the United States, the Ukrainian government, and the US media is claiming is that this is an act of genocide on the part of Russia. Again, the facts do not add up. So the New York Times claimed that these dead bodies in Bucha have been there. They were killed on March 19th. Now, one of many problems is that if you look at the videos of these dead bodies, it's impossible that these dead bodies could have been there from March 19th, because the Ukrainian military retook control in April, March 19th to April, and then we look at the bodies. These bodies are not rotten, they're not decomposed, they're not, bloated and all this. These are relatively freshly killed bodies. And if these bodies were indeed there from March 19th, they would be bloated. They would be, in many cases, oozing out, liquefied organs, and, the skin color would be totally changed. They'd be decomposing. Some of them would be exploding from the buildup of gases inside of the body. At the very least, bloated and discolored and oozing and stuff. These bodies, you can see in the videos, are not that way at all. They look very recently killed. And furthermore, if we look at these videos, if you look closely, many of the bodies, and this is mainstream media, even video footage of this is footage put out by the Ukrainian government. If you look at the videos, at many of these bodies, you will see the white armband on the bodies of the people who were killed. The white armband is worn by the Russian military, and it's also worn as a show of support for the Russian military, or if you're in an area where the Russian military is operating, you would wear that to show that you are not hostile towards them, and that if you want to interact with them, get food and such, or pass through. So this would indicate that these people were pro-Russia, or at least somewhat affiliated with Russia. Again, not all of the bodies, but some of the bodies have this white armband. Furthermore, many of the bodies, you can see nearby a green box with a white star, which if you see in the video is you can clearly identify it as the Russian rations, food rations that the Russian military has been passing out as aid to the Ukrainians. This is another indication that these people were getting aid from Russia. These were pro-Russia people, or in the very least people that were working with Russia. Now, we also have video from a Bucha city council deputy, Katerina Ukraintseva, who says in a video that once Bucha is taken, that civilians should stay indoors, and that if they hear shooting, not to panic, but stay away, stay indoors, because they're carrying out what she describes as cleansing operations. Now, in the context of some of these bodies with Russian rations and armbands showing support of the Russian military or cooperation with the Russian military, what this would indicate is that these people were in fact killed by the Ukrainian military in what this Ukrainian city council deputy described herself as a cleansing operation, and that this was a war crime committed not by Russia, but by the Ukrainian government. Again, we don't know. There needs to be an investigation. This is not certain. But what this would indicate, if you look at all this information, this would indicate this. But for some reason, the media is not talking about this as even a potential possibility. They don't even mention this at all. It's totally ignored. And again, interestingly, these claims that it was Russia that carried out this massacre, the Pentagon has stated that they can't confirm claims that it was Russia that carried out this massacre. As of today, the Russian Ministry of Defense has reported that the Ukrainian armed forces have lost 132 aircraft, 105 helicopters, 2,213 tanks and other armored combat vehicles, 2,110 special military automotive equipment, 456 unmanned aerial vehicles, 249 multiple rocket launchers, 966 field artillery and mortars, and 245 anti-aircraft missile systems. Now, another aspect of US and Ukrainian propaganda in this conflict is the media coverage of the missile strike that happened at the Kramatorsk railway station, which was an outrageous attack against civilians. Dozens of civilians were killed by a Tochka-U missile. Now, what the Ukrainian government and the US media is claiming is that this was Russia that carried out this attack. Well, if we look at the facts, again, this appears to be a complete reversal of reality. The Tochka-U missiles are used exclusively by Ukraine. Russia does not use these missiles. And furthermore, the flight trajectory of this missile tracked shows that it came from Ukrainian territory, not territory controlled by Russia or the forces of the Donbass. Now, furthermore, we have even more evidence because on the missile, we can see the serial number, which proves absolutely that it was a Ukrainian Tochka-U missile, not a Russian one. The serial number proves this. So this is yet another example of where the Ukrainian government, US politicians, and the US media is lying, completely changing, not even a small lie, but completely reversing reality. Now, the issue of the biological weapons labs in Ukraine. Now, if we look at what the US and Western media has been claiming about the biolabs in Ukraine, they would have you believe that this is some crazy conspiracy theory with no backing whatsoever. There's no credibility to it at all. Anyone who thinks this would have to be out of their mind. This is what they want you to think because they don't want you to actually look into this at all. And many of these websites that do supposed fact checks, in reality, there's are propaganda websites that always do these so-called fact checks that serve the establishment, serve the corporations and the US government. They are claiming that this is crazy conspiracy theory pushed by Russia and quote-unquote right-wing websites, even though there are plenty of left-wing alternative websites that have been pointing out that no, indeed, this is a fact. There are these American biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine. And we had basically confirmation of this by Victoria Nuland in a hearing where she was asked about Ukrainian bioweapons labs. She was asked if Ukraine has these labs, and she gave a very awkward answer where she didn't flat out deny it. She didn't say, no, they do not have this. She did not give a negative at all. What she said was, in fact, that Ukraine, she gave a very elusive answer, which would indicate actually that she's saying, yes, they do have these labs. What she said was that Ukraine has biological facilities. She did not deny it. She went on to say that Ukraine has biological facilities. She did not say that they did have weapons labs, but she said that they have these facilities.
Does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian troops, Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
Now, does anyone think that Ukraine, the most corrupt country in Europe, one of the poorest countries in Europe, a country where there's an ongoing war, has been this ongoing war for 8 years, there would be some cutting-edge biological research going on for some new pharmaceutical drug? No, it's quite obvious that these biological facilities are there for military purpose. Now, furthermore, the Russian government has published documents which basically prove and demonstrate the U.S. government's involvement, the funding of these laboratories, and the various American corporations' involvement in this and their funding of this and all this. And apparently Hunter Biden has actually been very much involved in this, and some of his emails have actually exposed some of this. And this is not some crazy conspiracy theory that the mainstream media wants to make it out to be. This is all been published by the Russian government at this point, and this is all available to you. Now, this should not come as a surprise because the United States has a long history of biological weapons program. You know, after World War II, the United States picked up both Nazi German scientists and Japanese scientists who were involved with horrendous crimes against humanity, human experimentation, and developing of these biological weapons and drugs and various forms of lethal experimentation. And that the United States, after World War II, basically continued the programs of the Nazis and the Japanese of developing biological weapons. And this is all available. This is not some crazy conspiracy theory people can look at, particularly with Japan, a Unit 731 in Manchuria, where after the war, the Soviet forces liberated Manchuria. And as that was happening, these Japanese scientists and officers fled back to Japan, and the United States made a deal with these war criminals that if they gave their information to the United States, they would not be put on trial. And similar things happened with the Nazis. You had these Nazis doing human experiments on humans during the Holocaust. And these Nazi war criminals were taken in by the United States, and their science development of these various weapons and drugs and stuff were taken and continued by U.S. scientists. Now, going forward, something that people should keep an eye on, not directly related to the situation in Ukraine and the Donbass and Russia, but important to keep an eye on because it is relevant in the context of NATO versus the growing multipolar world. France is going to be having an election soon, and the candidate Marine Le Pen claims that she will get further away from U.S. hegemony and sort of push for a more French nationalist position and improve relations with Russia. Now, we should naturally be somewhat skeptical of this because we've seen a similar phenomenon with the right-wing politician, Donald Trump, who claimed that he would reduce the globalism and U.S. regime change and everything and improve relations with Russia, when in reality there was actually really no change of the U.S. policy internationally. It was a continuation of what's often called globalism, in reality Western imperialism, Western U.S. dollar hegemony around the world. But it's worth paying attention to, because if Marine Le Pen does win, and she does in fact improve relations with Russia and take a more independent stand away from the United States, that would be a positive thing. Now, we don't know if she will in fact do that. This is all up in the air. But if she were to do that, that would be very significant, because the war in Ukraine is not only about the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is really a symbol of the clash between the Western hegemonists, the United States imperialism, NATO expansionism, and not just Russia, but the whole world that's striving to become independent, to develop, and to not be controlled by the Western colonial powers. That's what Ukraine really represents. You know, NATO went in and overthrew Ukraine's government in 2014. You guys probably remember all the history there. This was an example of NATO expansionism and Russia standing up to defend itself, as this being the last straw, where they're not going to allow NATO expansionism to continue any further. This represents, you know, a clash between the hegemony, the forces of hegemony, U.S. expansionism, NATO expansionism, and the world, the third world, and the East, and the global East and the global South, standing up to the Western imperialists. So if France is able to move away from the NATO expansionists and take more of an independent stand, that would be a major blow to the forces of imperialism, and an important win for the forces pushing for independence and multipolarity in the world. Now, something else to keep an eye on. We've heard for a while the Western press, U.S. media, politicians in NATO talking about Russia supposedly committing a chemical attack, that Russia's planning a chemical attack. Again, we think back to Syria and other cases where the United States talked about chemical attacks to justify intervention and such. This is something to be aware of, because we don't know what could happen. We could have a situation where a false flag is carried out, or nothing even taking place, and the West trying to claim that a chemical attack took place. We'll have to keep an eye on this, what's going to happen, but it's very suspicious that the West, the NATO powers, are talking about Russia potentially carrying out a chemical attack. We'll have to keep an eye on that.